So one of the tough things when you're in a narcissistic relationship is figuring out your values or reminding yourself your values. Let's talk about values in these relationships. I was listening to someone share a difficult story recently. She had worked hard her entire life, put herself through school on her own dime, succeeded in an incredibly competitive industry, and she took some risks and chances that happened to pay off. She's also good at what she does. She'd been married to a narcissist. She got divorced from a narcissist. It was very expensive, and she went through the challenges of co-parenting while paying him spousal and child support and balancing child rearing. So after 30 years of really backbreaking work, she'd gotten really what was almost international acclaim. She'd made a decent amount of money. She wasn't rich, but she definitely was head and shoulders better than how she grew up, had more money than the average bear, and she was pretty comfortable. Her family of origin, though, not so much. They never sort of rose. And her family of origin was a very toxic system. Just about everyone was entitled. Nobody really encouraged her or ever offered encouraging words while she scraped by to make it and worked so hard. None of anyone in her family ever took initiative. And when she finally made it, they took a stance of, well, you owe us. You were lucky and made it. And all of us are struggling. And they insisted that she owed them and had to pay their rent and sometimes spot them some money for some stupid new business they wanted to start or pay for a new car. Guilt often motivated her. It felt like almost a form of survivor guilt. She made it and succeeded, and she loved what she did for a living, and they didn't. And though it was manifestly clear to anyone looking at this story from the outside in that she worked hard and honestly for all of it, and they largely sat around and complained about how their lives were unfair, the old story, the trauma bonds and the intergenerational stuff and the guilt at being the one who succeeded all left her feeling like she owed them something, that she had had good fortune, and they were struggling. They were struggling because they were lazy and they never did anything. And so she felt compelled to do what she could to make their lives a little easier. It would take years before she could clearly see the narcissism and enabling and antagonism, and above all, for her to see that they weren't going to change. So for years before that, though, she spent buckets of money and time trying to make it all better. By the time she hit her early 60s, she wanted to slow down, take some time to no longer work 7 days a week, breathe, and enjoy what she created. But that damn family system, of course, none of them ever got it together. If she paid for college, they dropped out of school. They were getting fired from jobs for not showing up, and she introduced them to the people to get the jobs. They trashed the homes and apartments she got them or rented for them. They don't maintain the cars. And they had, like I said, grandiose dreams about ridiculous business ideas that they did not have the expertise to launch. The family system, again, was comprised of just people who were different kinds of toxic, vulnerably narcissistic, manipulative, entitled. They took no responsibility. And again, back to that entitlement. They all felt that she owed them something. She made it. So again, the idea was that she had to lift all of their boats. As she got older, from her 50s into her 60s, she still felt very beholden to an aunt and her mother who had both had very difficult lives and who both variously enabled their own adult children. The woman felt that she had to ensure that her aunt and mother, who were both getting quite old, were taken care of. She found a great setup for them that would offer them care and meals and all that other stuff, and she offered to pay for it. But the aunt and mom didn't want to move from their respective apartments, not because the place she was offering to them wasn't good, but the aunt and mother were enabling their entitled adult children, who had all failed to launch and who were all living with them. So if they moved to a place where they would have to move alone to be cared for, their kids who were sponging off of them would have nowhere to go. Because the woman refused to keep paying up the rents on these apartments and homes, and she would sell the home, and she would sell the home she bought for her aunt and her mother and the apartment she had rented for one of them, and get them set up in a comfortable place where they would be looked after, but that meant all of these other adult children would be out on the street. Because this woman wanted to retire, she wanted to manage her money in a way that she would ensure that her mother and aunt got taken care of for the remainders of their lives and had what they needed. But keeping up the house that she had bought them, and which their adult children had really trashed after moving into it, was beyond her financial means because she wouldn't be making as much money. It all makes sense, right? Well, the aunt and the mother refused to move. Again, not because they didn't value the other place, but because they were trying to ensure that the failed other adult children would have a place to live. So I'm sorry for this long story, but I am sure many of you have known variants of this. This woman, after doing the right thing for nearly 65 years and caring for multiple elders in her family, getting them a home, paying for carers, getting meals organized, ensuring that these older adults had walking around money, and giving a leg up to everyone else in her family, and nobody ever stepped up and adulted in her family, she was done. And if you asked this woman what her values were, she would have said discipline, hard work, kindness, ambition, respect, and duty. A sense of duty and obligation for her mother and aunt were key values to her, and to a much, much lesser degree, her children, who had long since taken advantage of her generosity. But with the aunt and mother's refusal to move, this woman was in a bind. She would have to stop paying for many of the things that they needed as her income dropped, and she needed to ensure she had savings accumulated to take care of herself in her older age. But had they moved to that place, that other place that they were familiar with, that she would paid for, it would have been affordable for her to ensure their care and to see them frequently. But the aunt and mom, again, weren't moving because their adult children didn't want to find their own places to live, and their adult children were manipulating them to stay in place. And because this woman also paid the utility and the heating bills and all the other bills that would come with that, right now all of that was covered because the woman was paying for it. The devastation for this woman was that she was going to have to give up on her values of duty and obligation and step away from the situation. She did this little by little. Things were slowly slipping away. She no longer gave her mother and aunt money because they were giving ATM cards to their kids and the accounts were getting depleted. The internet got turned off because this woman wouldn't pay for it anymore. She simply made sure that there was a landline. She stopped paying for a cell phone plan. She gave the mother and the aunt burner phones for use in an emergency. The gravy train stopped for these other loser adult children. But the grief for this woman was that she felt she was giving up on fundamental values for herself, of really taking care of her elders, in the face of them not cooperating, and seeing that the mom and aunt were enabling their adult children, who were living in essence rent-free, using that free internet, using the aunt and the mother's cell phones. And a big part of this woman's identity was locked into doing the right thing by these older family members. The entitlement, the enabling, the toxicity, and the narcissistic patterns that hadn't shifted in over 40 years meant that she was having to take uncomfortable steps to actually take care of herself in a really real way. Had she kept spending money the way she was, she simply would not have had enough money for her own process of aging and need for care down the line. And we can say clearly that none of these family members are going to step in and help her. It was still early days. Is only at this point the internet had been turned off, but there were already accusations that this woman was selfish for what she was doing because she was no longer paying for everything for everyone, and she was letting down the aunt and the mother. And she was being characterized as leaving her mother and aunt high and dry. Family members started sending her really mean text messages. It didn't matter that most of their lives had largely been bankrolled in one way or another by this woman. When she had to make a practical decision and offered an excellent, probably even better option for these elderly family members, she was told that she was selfish and dishonorable and wasn't doing her duty by them. But the harder hit was for her. This is what I mean when I saw when I say this idea that the boundaries conversation is ridiculous. She set what could be called a boundary, and that so-called boundary flew in the face of her own value system. To not care for older adults in her family was literally a violation of her own value, her own key core values of duty and responsibility. And that was a core part of her identity. This woman's process of healing was identifying and getting back to her values, but at the same time, healing and simple survival meant that she could no longer live in line with those values. Lots of people like to talk about values-based living and setting boundaries and healthy relationships. That's all lovely and nice until you're talking about a narcissistic family system. How the hell was this woman supposed to live in line with her values? In these families, there's no such thing as doing the right thing. In her case, she did the right thing 1,000 times, and in many ways. She made educational opportunities and other opportunities available. She made jobs available for the younger generations of the family. They would drop out of school. They would drop out of the job she found them. She'd drop out of the internship she connected to them. And they would play the victim. They didn't take me seriously. She learned in those situations with the children, with the younger generations and her siblings, to give up more quickly. And she'd given up on all of them years before, and that was hard enough for her. She still felt she was abandoning a role in her family and giving up on people. But with her aunt and mother, she had very much done the right thing, buying them an affordable home, paying people to care for them when they needed it, ensuring that they had some little walking around money, ensuring that their health care, she followed up on all that paperwork. But when the mother and the aunt became enablers in a way that was financially actually dangerous for her, there was no way for this woman to split things up and say, you can be here, but the rest of them have to go. This wasn't a conservatorship situation or anything like that. The mother and aunt were of sound mind. But it was a glimpse into the layers and layers and layers of harm that toxic dynamics can create. And having to grapple with the idea that the mother and aunt were choosing the more griftery arm of the family over her after her years of help made their lives and care possible was devastating. And that even after years of doing the right thing, the story would end with the final chapter being that she was selfish and walked away when the two family elders needed her. Boundaries sound good on paper and as pat advice, but we have to ask ourselves the questions about the internal sacrifices that we may have to make to be able to set external boundaries. This woman intellectually recognized that she had to do what she had to do, but she lived in grief and rumination about putting her aunt and mother in what felt like a very suboptimal situation. She said she was open to the day that her aunt and mom, or either of them as individuals, would actually work with her on a situation that could work for her mother and aunt. But as long as the siblings and cousins and other hangers-on were playing victim and telling her mom and aunt that, oh, this woman was taking advantage of them, she recognizes that that's not going to happen. And I have no doubt that many of you hear elements of her story as yours. When I heard her sharing it, I could feel the helplessness in me. And I could see the competing demands of having to not lose herself to a harmful family system, living in accordance with her values, especially of duty to her family, and then recognizing that that meant leaving some of the enablers that she loved and worried about behind, and doing what felt like giving up on her values, and frankly, giving up on people. Those don't feel like choices. So when we think about this, living in line with one's values, and ultimately then how do you make that work? That at some point, these folks would have let this woman get completely sucked dry. And she knows that this may very well culminate in a rather disastrous circumstance, but that you're caught in this eternal game of chicken. If you try to set a boundary, if you even want to call it that, in a narcissistic relationship, ultimately, when we do the work of saving ourselves in these relationships, we will always be called selfish. And for this woman, the writing was on the wall. This family had no problem bringing this woman to bankruptcy. They've always lived close to the bone. To them, making that ask of her was nothing. But for her, there was still a self-preserving part of her that remained strong. That said, she still, despite all the success and all the hard work, this grief remained a prevailing emotion for her because she could not live in line with her values. And that is a paradox of the narcissistic relationship. Thanks again.